Today we're happy to welcome Frank Lipo. He is the leader of the Oak Park River Forest Historical Society and the Oak Park River Forest Museum. And he has been in the role as head of the Historical Society since 1993. He's a graduate of Notre Dame University and has an MA in Public History from Loyola University. He's talked to us previously and been very well received about various aspects of the history of Oak Park, and today he's going to talk about the religious histories of Oak Park and River Forest. Frank and his wife raised 3 daughters in Oak Park. Frank.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. There we go.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be back. As I'm talking, and I know there's also a camera on me and then there's people across the room, do raise your hand if you have a really important question at that moment, or if you can't hear me, most importantly. I'll try to remain steady, but then I get kind of into it. I'm doing this kind of stuff, so I'll try not to do that. The topic, when we first discussed it, about what would be a good topic, last year I came and talked a lot about the history of fair housing, sort of really kind of 2 parts, like early stories, and then talking about the last 50 years, the last 40 years, the last 30 years. And I think the churches, the religious institutions of Oak Park and River Forest broadly, remember we are the historical site for Oak Park and River Forest, both villages, and our museum there at Lake and Lombard tells a lot of stories about both villages. But this topic is too big really for one talk, right? Like the whole history of religion or something like that. So when I was preparing this, my goal was to sort of talk about the context of religion, of churches, of religious institutions, within the context of the history of the community and how they develop sort of up together, maybe some splits along the way, and how, sort of in summary, as you all are living life in this area, coming to First United, you'll have a lot of contemporary stories, things you're involved in that involve the churches, the religious institutions of Oak Park River Forest. Of course, as I've just said, along the way, trying to give you a big idea of what I'm really going to be talking about, to narrate a little bit, is this idea that, that our community's history was intertwined with church history. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. The roots of the community, some of the people who came here were very firm believers in the role of churches in their daily lives and the community's life. I think one of the things that's happened, of course this is across the United States, is the more secularization of society, the idea that churches maybe are a little bit more pushed at the periphery of some of these issues, as maybe secular institutions step into some of those same roles. But I'll be pointing out some of that as we go along. The other thing I want to avoid, your own church, of course, the 2 component churches, First Presbyterian, First Congregational, are central to some of that story, and I didn't sort of endeavor to say, and then First United did this, and then First Presbyterian did that, just trying to have a little bit broader perspective, but of course you'll have some thoughts on that as I go along. Of course, as a person, I mentioned where I went to school, I'm actually personally a member of St. Giles Church, been involved there in that parish, and a sort of a more latecomer to the religious scene at that parish in 1928. But this idea of 150 years, I'm kind of using roughly the early 1870s to mid 1870s as sort of a starting point, but you'll see I'll immediately contradict that, and we'll jump right in now. So let's talk about where Saints Rest came about. So here is an 1861 map of the Oak Park area, and it's kind of important, I think, before you start talking about churches, that even as early as 1861, this community, you remember the Potawatomi were pushed west of the Mississippi in Treaty of Chicago, 1833. The cattle strings buy a big chunk of land, all of what's now between Harlem and Oak Park Avenue, between Chicago and the train tracks, Green Line or Metro tracks, right? So yes, the land was purchased by Europeans, folks coming from England in that case. But from the 1830s until around 1860s, there's sort of scattered settlement. The Kettle Strings themselves went back and lived in Chicago for a big chunk of time to have their kids have schools. There was an idea of some absentee ownership. A lot of the other land that was bought, what's now physically Oak Park, was really very speculative. People buying huge chunks of land and hoping that the prices would go up or they'd sell over time. So it's also important to kind of sort of where does this story begin is Civil Wars era. Harlem is essentially today's River Forest and Forest Park together. And Oak Ridge is sort of Oak Park, but the boundaries were very fluid. Harlem was west of Harlem Avenue was in Proviso Township. East of Harlem Avenue was in Cicero Township. There's even like the big governments that were kind of governing this area were just not set up for a municipal sort of structure in these little towns. So just to give you a sense of that, so here's like Lake Street, right in the center is roughly where we are. Very small number of buildings. This was done years later in the 20s by sort of a pioneer remembering the story and somebody sketching out some of the stories. But you can see how these little kind of hamlet that was the Harlem or Oak Ridge. When they went for a post office in the 1870s, they tried to get a post office under the name Harlem. There's already a post office out in Rockford, and that area that's why they kind of came up with the name Oak Park, and that's sort of that with a new train station started to be Oak Park as a name on the map. And another bit of context, same year approximately, this is a flyer which you'll be able to read very well yourselves, but I'm just going to share a little bit with it. As the West is fast recovering from its financial embarrassments, the Panic of 1857, some people consider the first sort of national depression, international actually, aspects of it, and the East must soon set in again with full tide. The attention of those seeking homes in this new country is asked for a moment to the advantages of Harlem, or Oak Ridge, as it is sometimes called. The place is the first station on the Galena-Chicago Union Railroad west of Chicago, being 8 miles from the city and the first elevation from the level prairie. And it goes on talking about the agricultural benefits. A great place to grow strawberries and small crops, garden for the big city, right? So there's this agricultural thing. But they talk about this great new school they just built at essentially today's Forest and Lake Street. Brand new school, a free school. There's great transportation coming out from the city, including a train daily that leaves this area first thing in the morning and comes back after work. So if you're commuting to Chicago for your job. And it goes on to a lot of the sort of, it sounds familiar, like transportation and good schools and great land, and we want great people to settle here. And then it says, besides this, now this is even broader than today's Oak Park, River Forest Park, what we call Elmwood Park, or even part of Austin. It would be sort of this bigger area which is yet completely defined. Besides this, one of the things they say that from this height you can see the buildings and the church steeples of Chicago. So this height with nothing in between, right? So there's that kind of thing. Besides this, the number of other, it says, the population of this neighborhood now numbers about 300, and they desire ascensions of good families who come to build up pleasant homes. To each they will give a cheerful welcome, be they rich or poor. So there's this idea of like, it's a land sales piece, of course, but it's also talking about what are some of the things, why would you settle here versus all over Metro Chicago? And so there starts to be a little bit, even though it's a PR kind of real estate thing, the idea of families and good people. So of course, it starts with people, I just mentioned Joseph Betty Kettle Strings, Methodist, came from England. He first was working had been a sawmill at Lake Street in the Des Plaines River, buys this big chunk of land, and a staunch prohibitionist, a person who believed that sale of alcohol was not good for society. And then famous names, famous parks, right? Their homes are now parks. James Scoville left right across the street from where we are, essentially, and Henry Austin Sr., Austin Gardens Park. Again, folks who came from Western New York, a lot of New Englanders. The idea that this should be sort of on the model of New England in this community. There's a little bit of that sense, and a lot of people coming from New England and from Western New York, etc. And in there, Henry Austin, of course, famously was basically a few taverns crept into Oak Park in the early days, and by the 1870s, he bought them out and shut them down. And Oak Park was a dry community for 100 years. So people who are already thinking about the community and not just the chunk of land they're buying, what is the type of community that we're going to build here in what would be one day be Oak Park? Obviously, these are later images, but just a sense of the Scoville House, that's the grander 1880s house, replacing the more modest 1860-ish house. Austin House below, again, was remodeled in this form. This is like a 1903 photograph. And then just a postcard from, soon after the turn of the 20th century, the idea of this Oak Park Avenue, Lake Street area, now called the Hemingway District, right, that some of these earlier families were building more commercial structures. The big smokestack on the right is the water and power plant that the Scoville built and then later became like a commercial operation. So the idea of bringing fresh water and power, again, community building that this first generation really left to the community. A really big starting point, it's really important to think about religion and about churches and religious organizations, is Temperance Hall. 1855, that's the first school as you see. There's the Albion high-rise on that corner now, right? I was laughing when it was under construction, they have those boards across it, and they had an image, because they came to the historical site and did some research, you're like, oh, where Temperance Hall was, and the new Albion, with a workout room, but anyway, old and new together. So this structure was the little white schoolhouse until, for about only 5 years or so, and they built a brick schoolhouse across the street where the earlier high-rise is on the south side of Lake and Forest. The first glimmers of organized religion, some early reports, people like the Kettle Strings would have itinerant Methodist ministers come by. There's a little circuit, circuit riding for religion in those days, very common in rural areas. But by the early 1860s, there's starting to be this sense of there's a bunch of us from different sort of mainline Protestant denominations. None of us individually can really get a minister here full-time or anything like that. We don't have a building. This is really kind of still a semi-rural area, even though we have a train line to Chicago. So Temperance Hall, there's also an overlap with schools from the start. People like Kettle Strings and Scoville are also serving on essentially what became Cicero's School District Number 1, what's now today's District 97/District 200. And there is this sense that some of those teachers in the public school were also divinity students. There's an overlap between public schools and religious instruction. In 1863, just a couple of years after that, those drawings and handbill I just showed you, the Union Church, a non-sectarian, it was probably a little more congregational. They say congregational in structure. The Oak Ridge Church of Harlem, they were having it both ways. I was talking about, what is this area called? It's the Oak Ridge Church of Harlem. It could have been the Harlem Church of Oak Ridge, probably. Basically, that 1850s, when this building is built into the 1870s, early 1870s, you start to get churches then breaking off of this Union Church. So by 1871, there was 13 charter members of First Congregational Church, and they built the first building with a bunch of additions, kept on getting built right through the decades. By, I think that's 1873. A Lutheran church, German Lutherans, what's today's Forest Park was very German. Certain Northwest Oak Park was very German. And a Methodist church in 1870. So a whole series of as the population is growing, all of a sudden you start to see the growth in specific denominations. And one thing they had in common, these new denominations, is they overall, and all these things I'm saying when I'm talking about a mainline story, of course there's people who are not temperance folks. So we're sort of talking about majority, a sort of sense of the overall community. Just so you know, I'm quite aware that somebody's great-great-grandfather was not part of this story. But generally we're talking about the major trends. And so one of the things we have at the Historical Society is the records of this Temperance Alliance of Oak Park. There also is a chapter of the WCTU. Francis Willard, who formed that organization up in Evanston, had taught in River Forest briefly, so there's a connection to our area also. And so there's a WCTU chapter, but there was this Temperance Alliance of Oak Park, And this is one of the first pages in the minute book, and they're talking in 1878 about, at the bottom it says, motion prevailed that there should be a temperance service. And it was at the new First Congregational Church, hosted the first one. And the whole series of what do these churches have in common? Again, the first thing to talk about this, what are the common interests and sort of concerns of the churches? And one was, in this area even, I mentioned the German folk, there got to be a sense of, a lot of those German immigrants are too into their beer halls, too much into their picnics with beer being served. We're different than that. Some of them are Protestants, some of them might even be Catholic, some of them may have no religion, but we know that one thing, this newer community, beginning to be called Oak Park in the 1870s, with a train stop with the name Oak Park, with a new post office, the name Oak Park's going to be rising above this earlier vagueness of what is Harlem, what is Oak Ridge. Oak Park's going to have some community values that are in common, and this is glued into this book of Temperance Lines of Oak Park, and it's a little bit confusing. I know it's especially further, but this is on the. I guess I can do this. This is on the right. On the right is this is Chicago Avenue. Chicago Avenue. So this is the north. Sorry about that. On the west, on the top is the Des Plaines River. So that's the west of this. So I don't know, fit it vertically. They put it like this. But if you look, you'll see that they have all the churches listed. It's a little bit hard to see, but they'll say in River Forest. There is a Catholic church, St. Luke's, the first sort of Catholic church in the area. It says R.C. Church, R.C. Church. And then they have the names of the individual churches. Unity Church is south of the tracks at that point, kind of over by today's Pleasant Home. So you have the whole community divided into these districts, 6 different districts. I think they call them precincts even. And districts, and in the notes they talk about precincts. So they basically are thinking this in a very political sense. We need to canvass, we need to have those individual churches help us with this temperance issue. We need to not be a community that is allowing the liquor interest to take over our community. So essentially, this is 1878. In 1880, River Forest organizes as a village, in part to head off what became Forest Park, or they actually incorporated in 1884 under the name Harlem. So there was this idea of the Anglos, the folks who are believers of temperance, should be proactive and form their own communities and actually fight liquor sales. Now, one of the things that's really interesting, I think we've got to think about this sort of step by step as we go through this historical talk today, is even some of the things we think about now, of course, about, we can say, oh, that's just so old-fashioned. We know that it didn't work during the national prohibition phase, and so that's why it was repealed. But temperance at this point wasn't just stop the sale of alcohol or don't consume alcohol. It was kind of often tied up with other social ills or other causes. So there's often an overlap between women's suffrage. You know, if you can keep the breadwinner, keep your husband from stopping off at the tavern and losing half of his money by buying a bunch of beers, or by of course there's also like gambling at taverns and that kind of thing. That would be good for the family. That would be good for the women. So there got to be this overlapping thing of what was a progressive issue of the time. We might use that term. When I use progressive and conservative, I'm very aware it changes over time. I'm not talking about today's political climate or anything. But there was this idea that this community, as it was sort of forming, should have individual strong churches of all the mainline Protestant denominations. We'll get to that later in terms of other religious faiths. But basically, that this was just not, oh, we don't want people to have fun, and we're not really anti-German, although some of the folks were sort of anti some of the immigration and didn't always get along with some of the other issues related to the Germans. When Henry Austin Sr. bought up the last taverns, he also got the state legislature to say there should be no more liquor license issued in this area. So that 1870s to 1970s temperance in Oak Park was a really major community-defining character that was set into motion by church folks and by some of these early leaders. So the community, just one issue of course, but the community continues to develop. And here's an aerial view of 1873. So already you're talking about 10 years after that, there gets to be some growth. So there's kind of constant growth in the community. And again, orientation, there's Chicago on the top of this, the top of the map here, Chicago Avenue. And there's also, here's the top of the map of Chicago. Here's today's Green Line and Metro tracks. And it kind of peters out over toward Lathrop and River Forest, this particular image, right? So you can see there's still really big chunks of just open space, some of it's like small agricultural uses. You see what becomes Circle Avenue over there in Forest Park. So sort of Forest Park, River Forest, and Oak Park overlapping. Remember, Oak Park is just emerging as a name at that time, and River Forest doesn't even incorporate for another 7 years. That name didn't even exist anywhere. It was Thatcher. It was on the train station, right? Thatcher family, who all heard of Thatchers. So this idea of growth is happening at the same time we're talking about growth of religions and of churches. I just want to give you a couple of different views of that. So another 20 years go by, and I'm moving quickly through time just to say this first 25 years, using roughly 1870s till, let's say, 1925, the community is just constantly growing. So 1871, it's the time of the Chicago fire, maybe 500 people to 1,000. There's no official census because, of course, the boundaries aren't really set the way they are today, but certainly no more than 1,000. 1880, it's going to become 2,000, so the population more than doubles in 10 years. 1890, 4,500. 1900, 10,000. 1910, 20,000. 1920, 40,000, 1930, 60,000. So just to give you the broad, so Oak Park's a boomtown during that era, right? There's just a lot of growth, and in fact, that first, from 1871 roughly to 1920, the population's doubling every 10 years. That whole period, doubling every 10 years, and the last time it goes up 2/3 from 40,000 to 60,000. So 1930 census is sort of the population max, 63,000, something in that range, right? Larger families, Oak Park's essentially built out, still some scattered lots, but you get the idea. So what do we see in this map? We see that some of that growth, the subdivisions by the 1890s. If you look closely, and it's kind of hard to see up there, but I think you might be able to see there's Scoville's name, there's Austin's name, over here is Kettle Springs addition to Harlem. Right? So you have this sense of these early families are still around. Austin family, there was an Austin living here up until 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago in River Forest. There were Kettle Springs living up here until 15 years ago, and there's some descendants. So there was some sense of those families and the churches they built and some of the institutions they built, even though the Temperance Alliance eventually shut down in favor of the WCTU. Oak Park stayed a temperance community, essentially, no sale of alcohol for 100 years. So it's important to kind of really spend some time, okay, that's Oak Park, how it's developing. Now, let's talk about what else was happening besides the growth of churches, and we're going to dive more into churches in a few minutes, is, Central School there at Lake and Forest was originally kind of that central section here, and then kept on adding additions. This is a 1903 photograph. The first high school starts, what became Oak Park River Forest High School, starts here in 1873. It's by 1892, there's a separate high school building built over at Lake and East because it's grown that much, right? So schools are very, very important to the community as it's growing, and churches and schools, people talk about the forming Oak Park, as Oak Park is forming and growing. Just a fun photograph. I love the whole high school, Oak Park High School, 1879, no River Forest yet. There must have been a tradition, I'm thinking that's the janitor. Anyway, we always laugh like, why does that guy have that broom there? And then there's definitely a few older teachers mixed in. So there you are, the massive Oak Park High School of 1879. So, and the official Oak Park, the official what do the realtors say, what's being advertised for Oak Park is street scenes from the 1890s. You see churches. You see the fact that here's two steeples right here. I was trying to figure out the angle on this. I'm not sure if this might be the Methodist church, like from the Austin's property, and this might be your steeple of the earlier First Congregational. Again, sidewalks, street trees, a line of beautiful, sort of middle class, slightly larger than middle class homes maybe, right? Street scene, that happens to be the Nathan Moore House. There's Forest Avenue already, right? So there's the official Oak Park. But what's also happening? Actually a little bit after that image I just showed you, 1903, Richland South from Madison, right? So that's not all the way to Roosevelt. Okay, but let's go all the way to Roosevelt. Austin, Roosevelt, 1903, right? So you still see very rural scenes. And the reason I'm saying that is, as this land is being subdivided, as homes are being built, of course, the original sort of Lake Street corridor of a Methodist church, Congregationalist church, a Presbyterian church, north and west, a German Lutheran church, there gets to be branches of all of these, as you well know, right? So Oak Park's, how do you know, it's a churchy community. It starts growing step by step by step, but even within that, instead of having those sort of central congregations with all of these other branches, a second congregational church, a third congregational church, a first Presbyterian, a second Presbyterian, you start to get some variety of beliefs. So I'm not going to deal with doctrinal matters today and how even an individual church comes apart, or how people disagree on certain issues that, pull apart a little bit. That's happening just naturally because different people, different income levels, different, there's the American immigration's growing and more people are coming from Eastern Europe and from other parts of Europe. So the Anglo sort of core original Oak Park is changing, right? Because all of that population growth I'm talking about, so that's affecting the churches. So what else is happening? I spent a fair amount just trying to give you a sense of this is not the Oak Park we know today. 1898, in 1898, I think I flipped these two out of order, put this in. 1898, in East Oak Park, where the Historical Society is located now, the Cicero Fire Company No. 2 was built. 1898, and this was this fine firehouse. They had volunteer firefighters in a little frame building before this. That's the advantage of the central government. Some of the growth, some of the tax dollars. Some people are saying, they spent $5,000 on that? What a crime. We don't need that big of a firehouse. And then people are saying, look at all those empty lots, right? We need to accommodate the growth. And Cicero, interesting enough, the head of the Cicero Township Board, who was from Austin, he, at the dedication for this building in 1898, he dresses down his political opponents, the paper says. He dresses down his political opponents because people were saying Austin was controlling too much of Cicero. Oak Parkers didn't have the votes. It was a 5-4 vote on a lot of issues. So this bigger area, Cicero was Austin, today's Austin, Oak Park, Berwyn, and Cicero, this much bigger area, starts to come apart. So they're building this brand new place, and Oak Park's seat of government was this building, later replaced by the Austin Town Hall Park District facility, which is not this building. People say, oh, that was the original seat of government. This is the earlier building. And this, that 1898 firehouse, in 1899, there ends up being a referendum, and Austin gets annexed to the city of Chicago. And in fact, Oak Park helped arrange that. Because Oak Park wanted its own independence. It didn't want to be it didn't want to be annexed to Chicago. We've been fighting to even get heard within Cicero Township. Why should we be part of, so I love this because this sort of sets up, shall we annex Austin? It actually was multiple ballot questions. Annex Austin and Oak Park together to Chicago, or the whole town of Cicero. And if you notice here, twice in this flyer, they say, how will either affect the schools and the saloons? And at the bottom, what should we do about the saloon question if annexation carries? What about our schools? And in fact, the president of the Board of Education of District Number 1, which is the Oak Park part of Cicero Township, is there. So it's very much about community character, education, Saloons is another way of saying churches too, because the temperance Oak Park was still dominant in terms of its official belief. Yes?
Help me understand here, this poster. It says, shall we? Who do they mean by we? I mean, who is this? Who's voting in this?
Yeah, so this is a flyer for a public forum, for a public referendum in the election of spring of 1899, and that's the one that Austin has voted into and annexed to the city of Chicago. It takes about, 1902 Oak Park formally incorporates. It takes a couple years of fighting over assets of the old Cicero, etc. And actually, the other thing about this is in the actual vote totals in the end of this election, the Austin precincts voted to stay in Cicero Township, and the Oak Park precincts voted overwhelmingly to have Austin be annexed to Chicago. So even though it was a vote of the whole Cicero Township, they were trying to get out the Oak Park vote, and it's in Berwyn, Masonic Hall. Berwyn wanted its independence too. So today's Cicero is the leftover area of the original Cicero Township. So they call themselves the town of Cicero still today. It's like the remaining section of that. By then, the town of Cicero, in what's now the town of Cicero, was very industrial. Western Electric had a major operation, very much immigrant, very much more blue collar than other parts of the community. So there was definitely some, there was cultural issues. So what happens? Oak Park, 1899, Austin's in Chicago. Late 01, they have a referendum. 02, Oak Park exists as a village. This is misleading, sorry. The building, the new village hall was opened in 1905. This is 1903 when construction began. But corner of Lake and Euclid, the original village hall, right? So Oak Park's aspiring to be its own community, and yet it wants to keep some of its values as it becomes a secular community of Oak Park, a village of Oak Park. The new Oak Park YMCA, this is around 1905. The same time they're building a village hall, there's a committee in town of all the church leaders, the Protestant church leaders. Our young men need some direction. We need a YMCA in town. Built an original section, keep on building sections of it. Now it's condos, of course. And this was replaced in the 1950s by the Y building down at Marion and Pleasant Street. But a grand building, a grand idea that Christian education, that there should be cultural, this new Oak Park shouldn't forget its roots as a place that valued church life. And the ministers want to stay together. This is a 1905 publication done for the Lenten season that the ministers of First Congregational Church, Reverend Barton, I think it's Presbyterian, Congregationalist, and Methodist. I think of the three. They basically come together and say, that earlier Temperance Alliance of Oak Park, they're trying to keep some of that together. And they have a thing called the Pastors Union, the Oak Park Pastors Union. And so they're trying to find, can we share some stuff? Can we still stay together even though we're separate denominations? What's our common ground? Things that have been there in Oak Park. There's an orchestra, say, formed. There's cultural things in the community that Oak Park wants to upgrade. And so in 1902, the Warrington Opera House opens up. There's the Opera Club condos at the corner of South Boulevard and Marion. That's where this building was. Later on, it was Marlock Banquet Hall. Many people remember that. So we should have an opera hall. We shouldn't just have a little orchestra. We should have our own opera hall. We should have, stock companies come in. But it's not going to be like those vaudevillian type, because we're Oak Park. And so the ministers were talking about the kind of entertainment that should be at a place like Warrington Opera House. More highbrow, not just in a sense of like culturally exclusive purely, but at least avoid the most base entertainment. Let's not turn this into any other community. So Oak Park's value as a community, that of course on the right is the site of today's main library and your church before the lightning strike and the fire and the rebuild in the teens in 1917 or so, is Scoville Institute, is this idea that this gift to the community by James Scoville, who lived across the street in 1886, by 1902, by the time Oak Park's his own village, right away they turned it to a public library. It was a private subscription library that Scoville set up. It's like, how are we now, this new Oak Park, becoming a village, a municipality, growing, and deciding to be somehow distinctive, right? So even by the 20s, Oak Park gets a nickname that it touts everywhere, a self-described nickname, it's a self-imposed nickname, the world's largest village. The idea that Oak Park is still a village, it's still people who know each other, but, oh, you could have become a city, you could have reorganized under the state law. No, we're gonna stay a village. But here in this Oak Park of turn of the century, they just became a community. What else is happening? The German Lutherans, the predecessors of today's Grace Lutheran actually, up on Augusta and Belfort, they have their own little schoolhouse. You see on the left side of this image, the left side of the image, they have that church that's still up there, still in that same corner denomination. I believe it's mostly an African-American congregation today. That is the Germans saying, we want our German language instruction. We're not exactly always in with you folks down there, you Anglos, you folks that say Oak Park has to be one way. So there's this enclave, there's certainly cooperation and discussions with all different groups, but there's definitely an inner circle of religion of the Anglos. And there's also the start of a more diverse community. 1905, the Mount Carmel Baptist Church is open. Today's Westgate, kind of behind today's Target store, is where this church was. Oak Park never has more than about 180 black residents according to the US Census, but they raised the money, they formed their own church. And all of the individual churches, I shouldn't say all, but most that I can find a paper trail of, were very supportive. Reverend Barton, the 20-year Lincoln scholar, renowned Lincoln scholar and pastor of First Congregational Church, was there at their dedication. They had, these churches were actually having some more diverse speakers, and they were supportive in some of the fundraising for this black church. For instance, Ida B. Wells came, and I believe she was at the Methodist Church. So they were having speakers, and they were talking about these issues in a way that not every single community was. So it wasn't a so-called sundown town where black folks might work there, but then not be allowed to live in the community, right? So there's discrimination, but there also was some open. So that was part of the Christian spirit of these churches, but also some limitations maybe. Who's in the inner circle of our belief system, and who might be a little more on the fringes. Here's another example. Oak Park does not have a Catholic church. River Forest had St. Luke's, and was sort of a missionary church to people who lived in Oak Park, in 1910, roughly, the church opens up, and they had to buy, the Archdiocese of Chicago had to buy that property through a straw buyer. They were looking at different properties, and there was talk about the Catholics wanting to build a church, and they weren't welcomed by everybody. Now, the fact that they had to buy straw, there might have been some Oak Parkers who wouldn't have blinked twice if they were, their property was being offered to be purchased by the Catholics. But some people didn't like that idea. And isn't Oak Park about this sort of, we don't want to lose our sort of, mainline Protestant work ethic and our support of churches and schools and all these wonderful things. This is a little bit later. There was, as early as the 1860s, there's at least one or two Jewish residents of what became Oak Park, a Steiner family, etc. But this is a little bit later, but the idea of Hanukkah at the Hebrew school at 505 South Maple, in somebody's home, they're having a Hebrew school. So there starts to be other, sort of a variety of religious traditions in the community. Let's not forget, the Unitarians, who had been south of the tracks over by Pleasant Home, over down there, the church burned, and Unity Temple, even the idea of church architecture is changing in terms of rights work and others. It's like, oh, this doesn't look like a church used to look like. Where's the steeple, etc. So I think this idea of change is in the air. So there's going to be sort of this first 25 years or so is going to lead to a second 25 years of more change and trying to deal with change. So I'm going to read you, right in this era, This is from a book called Glimpses of Oak Park, which is a wonderful real estate profile of Oak Park in the sense of it shows a number of great homes, but in 1912 when it comes out, it includes that new St. Edmund's Church. So there's some resistance, but there was a sense of Oak Park is like a new community emerging from just that little old Oak Park that they knew from the previous generation. And it's both, I think, a reality, but it also becomes quickly a brand and a way of differentiating the community from others. So in this book, there's an introduction, which is by itself speaks volumes, I think. Today, if you're trying to promote Oak Park, would the average person, would our village government think of having a local minister write the introduction? But the realtors thought that this made sense. It helped that it was Reverend William Barton, First Congregational Church, perhaps the largest, most influential Protestant church, and a noted Lincoln scholar I mentioned already, this was the era before university scholarship, historians in the same way. So it was a lot of like amateur historians, and he had wrote something in the range of 15 books on Abraham Lincoln, his papers at the University of Chicago. And here's how he starts out this account of Oak Park. 2 teamsters were hauling heavy loads of building material from Chicago to the rapidly growing suburb which adjoins the city on the west. The driver, who was in the lead, turned on his load and shouted back to the teamster behind him, "I've never been out here before. How shall I know when we get to Oak Park?" "When the saloons stop and the church steeples begin," replied the man in the rear load, "you'll know you're in Oak Park." This is a true story, he says. It is also a true description. People who go west have little difficulty knowing when they get there. It's more or less identified with church steeples does not mean that it is an oppressively religious town. So they're aware that when you talk a lot about like where the church steeple place, or is it like a utopian community that you have to belong to a certain church or something, yet the fact that Oak Park is more or less identified does not mean it's oppressively religious. It's a place of homes of the better class, and it fosters every institution that upbuilds the home. Attractive and unostentatious homes, wide and well-kept lawns, streets of generous width, spreading trees. And it goes on to talk about, out of such surroundings grow churches, schools, libraries, and places of wholesome recreation. So Oak Park, in a sort of PR sense and a communication sense, is building on the church tradition and the true belief, not to make fun of the true beliefs of many people that this is really important, or that their particular church or congregation is really important, and they believe in what they're espousing, but it seizes on as like, what is the community character of Oak Park? And this defining, coming out of this early era is sort of quality homes and high-level, high-achieving schools, and a place that actually has kind of everything you want, as long as it's avoiding some of the negative things. And of course, without even saying it, although it does say, I'll read another paragraph, it was determined very early that no liquor should be sold in Oak Park. This moral stand, taken in a day when it was less frequent than now, may be said to be the very cornerstone of Oak Park's intellectual and moral supremacy. Intellectual and moral supremacy, just to be simple about it. Through many a hard fight in the early days, this question was settled, and it's settled so definitively that it never since has been raised. So temperance is who we are. It's at the center of what we are. Because it was free from saloons and the temptations that accompanied them, Oak Park became at once an inviting place of residence for people who wanted clean homes and wholesome surroundings. And it goes on, talks about all the investment in the schools and the Colonial Club, the Oak Park Club, the Westward Ho Golf Club, and it goes. I'm not gonna go on any further, but at the end it does have a story about how a little boy says, "Why does Chicago have those stars on its flag?" And it says, "Oh, for the Great Fire," and he goes through. He says, "Well, if Oak Park should ever be annexed, would they add another star?" So it's really fun. You got to take a look at it sometime. Come to the historical site or take a look afterward. But yes.
Could you take some questions?
Yeah, I'll pause for some questions right now. Yeah, I could. Yeah, sure. Any questions at the moment?
Does that picture mean that the temple predates the post office?
Yes, the post office wasn't until the 30s. There's an earlier post office at Oak Park Avenue and Lake Street where the Courageous Cupcakes is. That's where the post office was earlier. So this was the post office one. So there's like single family homes along here that were bought for the post office. So that's one man's view. That's a man who had been the 20-year pastor. And yet in his own church, First Congregational, and in the community, and the world is changing, right? So Oak Park's trying to maintain certain values, as hats off to any community that's trying to maintain some values. The churches are trying to maintain what they believe in, but society's changing. And here's a different view. It's just as positive about Oak Park. That's 1912, Glimpses of Oak Park. This is 1913, a letter to the editor in the Oak Leaves by Philander Barclay, the famous bicycling photographer of Oak Park that we have his bicycle and so many photographs. Poor Phil's is named for Philander's American Grill, Barclay's American Grill, Philander's Restaurant. So he owns a bicycle repair shop, and he's kind of a modern guy. He's pushing bicycles, he kind of likes the new automobiles that are coming in, and he writes a letter to the editor. Keep in mind that there's only one movie theater in Oak Park that just opened 2 years previous, called the Playhouse, and you might go there to have breakfast. It's called Egg Harbor, that breakfast place across from the L stop. That's where the Playhouse, if you ever looked at that building, it's a theater. It wasn't built as a theater. And the letter's titled Sunday. The funny thing is, it's below an ad for the Warrington Opera House, the Grace Hayward Stock Company, doing a wonderful dramatic story that's very highbrow. And here's what he says. Should moving picture theaters and pool rooms be open 7 days a week? Knowing your columns are always open to fair suggestions on the part of your readers, and that your paper stands for the improvement and uplift of the community, I wish to bring up a subject that to many seems of importance. Is Oak Park doing the proper thing by keeping the moving picture shows and pool rooms closed on Sundays? I've talked with a great many people on the subject, and they find that at least 2/3 of them think Oak Park is making a grave mistake in keeping the places closed. This is ripped out of the headlines today. Young people today are fond of amusement, and it matters not to many of them whether they attend theaters on the Sabbath or not. They're looking forward to Sunday as a day of rest and recreation, and must be entertained. Is it better to have our young people go elsewhere on Sunday for amusement, or keep them at home? If our theaters and pool rooms are allowed to run, parents could see and know where their children were. So it's better to be in Oak Park, this nurturing place. And he goes on to acknowledge an undesirable class of people who often go to those places. But at the end he says, he's asking other people to join in with his, no better entertainment or education can be had for the boys and girls than the movies. So here we are in 1913, the stance of even just a thing, the movie theater's coming to town 2 years previously. You say, wait a second, is that controversial or not? And for the next 20 years, 1913 to 1932, there's going to be multiple referendums and much community discussion about, again, that idea of what is a Sunday for? Is it for the churches to have their members come into their services? Most people said, the great majority said, of course, but that ends early. You can go catch a movie in the afternoon, right? So this is ripped from the 1925 referendum, and it's a little bit blurry, my apologies for that. The one on the left is the scare tactic one. This is the same issue of the newspaper, right before the referendum for having the movies open on Sundays. They never got to the pool houses being open. They said, we'll focus on the movies. That'll be easier than the pool rooms. Give us your seventh day, and then this is commercial greed. It's a hairy hand with long nails, and there's sort of a church. It's not clear if that's a church or a theater, actually. It's sort of there's a temple that the devil is reaching for. Hands off Oak Park. Those ideals, which have made a better place to live, a cleaner environment for your family, steadily increasing property values, So it's called Citizens Organization Opposing Sunday Movies, okay? So there's this real effort to say, what are our values? And it's kind of that earlier thing, temperance, and it's like, what else makes a community have its values? The right, the more blurry one, I don't know where they got that number from, but hear ye, it's basically 14,000, I think it is 14,000, 15,000 young people, Oak Park young people ask you to vote no to Sunday movies. And then they talk about how it's going to affect us, it'll stop us from going and doing our homework on Sunday. I mean, it's really laying down thick. So you sort of have like, the wholesome young guy is fighting for his values, and the devil is coming in. So it's, wow, this is like not like subtle stuff. And then that's two approaches, scare tactics, or let's appeal to the young people. It's them that we're worried about. So, and I don't know what, who took a poll that young people didn't want it, but that's what they're saying. And then there's on the other side, vote yes for Sunday movies, wake up businessmen and citizens of Oak Park. There's a lot about property values because more property taxes will be generated. That money can be used for our schools and for all the good purposes. So there's a kind of classic thing about what does development bring exactly, and there's a whole series of points, and they're kind of, as you might expect, that why not have, we know that our friends and neighbors are going to Austin, and we don't want to have them leave. So there we have a minister who's the successor to Barton this is the First Presbyterian Church minister, and he's basically saying that the quietude of Sunday, the sort of chance to really tell to have your family around you at church is going to be destroyed. And this is the head of the school board and the local, just local leaders of all sorts. So what happens in the same election that Oak Park goes for Hoover? And there's a big front page ad about flour for Oak Park's needy families. In 1932, Oak Park votes 18,000 to 13,000 to allow Sunday movies. I didn't tell you earlier, but the 25 referendum with the scare tactics with the different sides, 15,000 to 6,700 against Sunday movies. So Oak Park's flipping in that not even 10-year period. The influx of folks, so 40,000 becoming 60,000 by 1930. So that's happening, but as we're entering the 30s, here's the Mount Carmel Baptist Church. There's talk about buying up the church to grow the commercial downtown of Oak Park. These original folks who are living here had been living through a lot of opportunity compared to some places, but also, here's from First Presbyterian Church, the men's Bible class, raising money for the Jefferson Park Church Boys Gymnasium, but having a minstrel show, right? So there's this discrimination, this old, 99% white community is in some of these issues trying to face what would happen. Here's just an ad from a local business, a derogatory ad about a black person in 1920. There is a chapter of the KKK in Oak Park. There's an example of this KKK chapter recruiting in an Austin church on a Sunday, going into the church and saying, we want you, because there were some individual Protestant churches that were buying into essentially a version of today, talking about like sort of white nationalism, like white Christian nationalism, like these Catholics, these people from Eastern and Southern Europe, they're not Americans. That's why this ad says from the Oakleys, by 100% Americans are wanted. 100% Americans. So it's not just anti-black, it's anti-immigrant. And of course, it's across the country. This is Gary, Indiana, only white people in fine homes. There are really blatant, terrible examples of racism. In Oak Park, it's not as dramatically so. And in fact, in Oak Park, to the credit of the community, churches, like the Forum of the First Congregational Church, are inviting African-American speakers, are saying and talking about racial justice in a way that other churches weren't always doing. Here's